everyone so much for having me here. I'm Jacob. I mostly work on natural language processing, but lately we've been getting really interested in sort of what we can do with language, not just as a sort of input or output modality, but as a tool for training machine learning models in other domains. And so what this talk is going to be about is really that, specifically looking at program synthesis problems. Sort of on that theme, I want to start with a very, very big question, which is the question of how people learn. And one of the kind of distinguishing features of human cognition is the ease with which we're able to acquire new skills and concepts. And we do this in a bunch of different ways. When we are lying in the crib, before we even can control our environments, we learn to sort of compress what we've seen and predict what's going to happen next. Once we gain the ability to act, we learn a huge amount from interaction with the environment, from exploration, from trial and error. Once we understand a bit about the social context in which our decision-making takes place, we learn a lot also from the sort of people around us, from labeling explicitly and from demonstrations from sort of skilled teachers and adults. And finally, once we have it, we learn from language. And so it's the last of these things that today's talk is really going to be focused on. The number of things that we learn about the world from language is really enormous, right? Sort of factual knowledge, like the causes of the First World War, procedures like how to bake a cake or how to write a program, and even information that extends our knowledge of language itself, things like definitions, things that we learn from encyclopedias. I would guess that most of us got here today by doing things like listening to lectures and reading books and, doing exercises that were communicated to us as written documents and talking to colleagues using language. Now, of course, our ability to do this, right, to learn using language relies really heavily on all these other kinds of learning. But once we've acquired language, it's really our most important tool, especially in adulthood, for acquiring all of these other complicated skills. And really one of the things that separates us from all of the other learning systems that nature has ever produced. Now, all these other kinds of learning that we looked at before correspond to like big established research directions with their own textbooks and their own conferences. But it's really just in the last couple of years that the research community has started to take seriously the possibility that language might sort of belong as a first-class source of supervision, along with these other things for general kinds of machine learning. And so what this talk today is going to be about is a little bit of work that we've been doing recently in my group in this direction on ways of using language to supervise other kinds of machine learning problems. And it's sort of keeping with the theme of this whole seminar series. This is mostly going to look at programming problems with some caveats. We're going to start with a little warm-up looking at ways of using language to supervise learning actually of robot policies, which look a little bit like code and are going to sort of introduce the general framework that we're going to use for learning here. And then we'll look at how to apply this framework to specifically program synthesis problems. And when we talk about learning from language, there's really two different ways in which we might learn from language, right? We might get sort of explicit linguistic supervision for the specific task that we're trying to solve, somebody, giving you a hint for a particular program synthesis problem that you're trying to solve. And we might learn from sort of general background knowledge conveyed in text, all of the text on the internet or all of the text in all of the programming textbooks that are out there. And so we're going to look at ways of learning from both of these forms of supervision, sort of targeted advice in the context of specific learning problems and just general textual supervision about programs in general. Cool, so let's dive right into this. And, like I said before, want to be transparent that the next 15 minutes or so are going to be a thinly disguised policy learning talk. But it's going to set up all of the ingredients of the program synthesis problems that we look at later on. So I mentioned before cooking as a sort of canonical example of a family of skills that we learn, at least in part, with natural language supervision. And if we're going to do big, complicated things like cooking in the real world, if we're going to sort of infer programs that when executed, let us do things like fry an egg or cook a chicken or something like that, we at the very least need to be able to do even simpler things in household environments, things like finding our way around, manipulating objects, interacting with really simple appliances, containers. So what we're looking at right now is an example from the Alfred environment, which is a household simulation environment designed around exactly these kinds of problems. Tasks in Alfred involve like clean a bowl of water and put it on the kitchen island and And you can see that the agent is navigating around in this environment and doing them. Now, how hard are these kinds of tasks? Well, we're mapping from images into some sort of discrete action space, right? A sort of set of discrete functional primitives for moving around in the environment. This feels like the sort of thing that should be straightforward with modern machine learning techniques. But it turns out that if we take even 20,000 demonstrations from this alpha environment and we train some sort of fixed deep network policy to map directly from like high-level natural language goals and observations in image form to this low-level space of action primitives or functional primitives, this actually doesn't work at all. Now, what might the reason be for this? It turns out that even these very simple tasks, right, like put a slice of tomato on the counter, involve a lot of moving parts. At the low level, we need to be able to do things like recognize objects and route paths between visible locations in the environment. And at the high level, we need to be able to reason about the long-term consequences of these low-level actions. And so even something as innocuous as the task that we're looking at on the slide right now requires finding a knife and grasping it and finding a tomato and slicing it and grasping it and moving to the counter and setting it back down again. And so there's quite a lot of intermediate structure here that we really need to be able to reason about in order to perform this task successfully. Now, if you think about how you learn to do complex things like this, and how you represent internally your plans for doing complex things like this, that intermediate structure is really, really, really important. So how might we build some kind of model that can reason about it explicitly? And most importantly, how might we actually train such a model with the kind of training data that we hope to be able to get our hands on? So maybe unsurprisingly, the most effective procedures that we've had for these kinds of tasks historically look something like this. We're going to have one model that decomposes our goal into a sequence of high-level subtasks, and then another model that's going to take each of these subtasks and translate it into a sequence of low-level action primitives. There's a huge huge literature on agent architectures that work this way, but they all require a ton of work to get working. They require you to either formalize your domain symbolically and engineer some kind of symbolic planning mechanism, or to commit ahead of time to some fixed inventory of skills, collect a bunch of targeted supervision for each of those skills, collect a bunch of additional supervision that tells you how to sequence those skills together for each high-level goal, and then you pipeline this sort of learned planning model and the learned acting model together. So how might language help us do better at these kinds of tasks? And the sort of key insight in this section, and in fact throughout this entire talk, is that language is a powerful tool for both reasoning about and representing high-level behaviors. It can tell us what features of a demonstration or a past experience are likely to generalize, and it gives us a flexible and, most importantly, compositional representational system for encoding goals and plans, and, as we'll see in a minute, programs. So we're going to operationalize this intuition by building a model that looks like this. Given a high-level goal, like put the knife in the drawer, we're first going to generate a sequence of natural language subgoals. And then from each of these natural language subgoals, generate a sequence of low-level actions. Now, notice that this is almost exactly the same sort of model architecture as these symbolic architectures that we were looking at a couple of slides back. But there's language in the middle layer, and that's going to make this differ in some important ways from existing work on sort of symbolic planning. The first thing to notice here is that because each of these high-level actions is just a natural language description of a subgoal, the set of possible high-level actions the system has is open-ended, it's compositional, and unlike in symbolic approaches where we have to sort of commit to a fixed set of sort of high-level actions up front, here the space of high-level actions that the system has is going to be in principle as expressive as language itself. The second thing to notice here is that getting supervision for which skills to use is going to be comparatively easy. Instead of having to teach a human annotator some sort of specialized symbolic planning language or robot programming language or whatever, we're just going to ask them to describe the steps that accomplish a high-level plan in language. And the last thing to notice here is that both our goals, put the knife in the drawer, and our plans, find the knife, grab the knife, blah, 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 are just strings. And so planning is just a conditional text generation problem. And as you know from sort of the language modeling literature in the last couple of years, we're really good at conditional text generation. And in particular, this means we're going to be able to learn a lot about how to plan without any action-specific data at all, and just text. And so good models of text are going to help us generalize even in tasks where we don't necessarily have any demonstrations on the robot itself. Okay, so to say this all one more time, language is going to do three things for us. First, it's going to give us a sort of flexible representation language for expressing the skills that our planning model can operate over. Second, it's going to give us an easy way of collecting supervision for this planning model using maybe comparatively unskilled annotators. And third, it's going to give us a way of leveraging corpus data, text-only data to generalize to new goals. Okay, so this is the model architecture. How are we actually going to train this? And sort of as we've been alluding to, we're going to start with something very simple. We're going to get a big data set of demonstrations for this task. And we'll just ask people to annotate these demonstrations with natural language instructions. So some important things to note. First, these are just free-form language. There's no guarantee of consistency in how things are described, within or across tasks. We're going to assume that we don't have any information about the correspondence between steps of people's instructions and steps of these low-level tasks, just like full instruction sets and full action sequences. We're going to assume that we have access to this information only at training time, right? So at the end of the day, we're trying to build an agent that can go out in the world and map from these very high-level goals to sequences of low-level actions, and only at training time are we going to have access to natural language to scaffold this learning process. And finally, even with all of these assumptions, this kind of supervision might be costly or difficult or expensive to collect. And so the last assumption that we're going to make is that we actually have only a little bit of it, that we have a big data set of demonstrations, and on that data set, only a handful of those demonstrations, a small fraction, have actually been annotated with these natural language plan descriptions. Okay, so here's what we have at training time, right? We have our environment, we have our goals, we have our demonstrations, and on a subset of those demonstrations, we have these sort of detailed step-by-step instructions as well. In other words, we have something that looks like a latent variable problem where on our annotated demonstrations, the correspondence between steps of these plans and low-level actions is latent. And on most of our data, the plans themselves are latent and have to be inferred. And so if we want to learn, if we want to train that model that we were looking at a couple slides back, we're going to need to fill in all of these missing quantities jointly with the parameters of the agent that we're trying to learn itself, right? So to sort of draw this very explicitly, we need to learn parameters for planning and acting policies that we've drawn in gray, and we need to fill in missing subtask labels or missing plan descriptions and alignments that we've drawn with these dash boxes. We can do this via map inference, just finding sort of hard assignments to our subtasks, our alignments, and our model parameters that just maximize the complete likelihood of our training data under this big learn policy. And I'm not going to talk too much about the learning story here, but briefly we can do this very simply via just coordinate ascent. And so we'll alternate between aligning pieces of these demonstrations to instructions, relabeling each chunk of one of these demonstrations with the best possible description, and updating the model parameters to fit the other variables. So we call this approach semi-supervised skill learning with latent language, but it's basically hard EM on these three steps. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the low-level algorithmic details. The one sort of fun one, just sort of computationally, once you've fixed your alignments and once you've fixed the parameters for these policies, the problem of sort of finding the plan that best describes a sequence of low-level actions looks like inference in a hidden Markov model, but a hidden Markov model where the state space is the space of all possible natural language action descriptions. And so there's some sort of fun things that you have to do with learned inference networks to actually make this tractable. But the short answer is that we can do it, and we can sort of automatically impute these natural language plan descriptions from just like raw low-level demonstrations. Cool. So what does this method do at training time? And at training time, we can do things like this. We can start with unannotated demonstrations, correctly segment them into reusable pieces, and label each of those pieces with a sort of correct natural language description of what is being accomplished at that step of the demonstration. And so here's, again, a sort of sequence of low-level actions that we were able to label as, well, step one is find the butter knife, and that's, from this time step to that step. Step two is pick the knife up, and so on and so forth. And maybe more importantly, here's what this model is able to do at test time. It can generate its own natural language plan description from a high-level goal, like place the washed pan on the counter, and apologize for the low-level or the low-res video, go out into the environment and execute this natural language plan that it generated for itself. Good. So having sort of seen that this works, I want to revisit these three things that language was supposed to do for us in the context of these policy learning problems. And the first thing that language was going to do is give us an easy way of collecting supervision. And in fact, here we succeeded in training this big hierarchical policy using nothing but sort of free-form, unaligned natural language descriptions provided by people who were just asked to describe what they saw in a demonstration. And so no sort of formal representation language, no symbols, no code, no PDDL anywhere in this annotation process. The second thing had to do with our representations of plans. And here we use this natural language supervision to induce a library of reusable skills that this agent can now deploy when it's interacting in the environment. And in contrast, the way that we usually think about skills in sort of robot learning and options policies and hierarchical planning approaches, here the space of skills is open-ended, it's compositional, it's extensible. In principle, this model has a skill for every natural language sub-goal we could give it. And this notion that we're going to use language to help us sort of discover a library of reusable skills is going to be really important in the second half of the talk. And finally, the sort of third thing that language was supposed to do for us was help with generalization. Predictive models of text know a ton about the right? Just by sort of asking a big language model, I think this is BERT that we're showing on the screen, to fill in missing words and sentences. You can do things like recover perceptual properties of objects, tools and sub-goals that you need to accomplish high-level tasks, common sense information about like the layout of environments or even dynamics of environments. I don't want to overstate, right? These models, and even much better models than the one that we're looking at on the screen, aren't perfect, but they contain way more information about sort of tasks in general and environments in general than I think we can possibly hope to get from any set of demonstrations that we collect on any specific robot platform or simulator, as long as we ask for that information in the form of text. And so we think back to this model architecture, right? As we said before, the top part of this model that goes from goals to plans is just a model of a relationship between strings and strings. And so we implement the top part of this model with something that's been trained on language data. We can generalize to all kinds of novel goals without needing any demonstrations in principle at all. And so, those, I think I'm not going to show any numerical results here, but, for the evaluations that we've done, for those videos that I was showing you before, all of these actions are resulting from plans that were generated by just like a fine-tuned, I think this was even just a T5 language model, like, by today's standards, relatively small language model that was pre-trained on a bunch of text. And this turns out to be super important for doing well, just in domain for the sorts of tasks that show up in this Alfred environment. But maybe more importantly, they also let us generalize way beyond what agents in this task are actually expected to be able to do. And so we can get, just using, again, relatively simple forms of pre-training, some crazy kinds of generalization. We can get these models to generate plans, that sort of operate on two objects when they've only ever operated on one object before. We can get them to bring objects into states that they've never been them before, do actions in orders that they've never seen before, and even in some cases generalize to totally out of distribution goals. So the sort of bottom right here, which talks about rinsing some tomatoes, the word rinse never appears anywhere in the training set for this model. We've never seen any kind of robot demonstration involving rinsing, but this planning model, just by virtue of having been trained on a bunch of text, knows that rinsing is something that takes place at a sink and correctly generates a plan that sort of directs the agent to the sink before it performs this rinsing task. Cool. Yeah, I think we have time for this. So one of the sort of fun things to watch after we put this paper out is how much interest there's been in sort of using language models to support these kinds of like policy learning and interaction tasks. So we put a preprint of this paper up in October of 21. And here we were really inspired by a bunch of work that had gone on previously, mostly in the NLP literature, on using these big language models to drive interaction in text-based environments. And in some sense, the sort of fundamental problem we were trying to solve here is how you get from text-based environments to sort of real perception and real action and things like that. And after we came out with this approach, there was a bunch of other work, especially from folks at Google, looking at ways of using these big language models also to drive policies in the real world. So if you've seen, for example, SayCan, you can actually think of SayCan as a sort of subset of the pieces of this model where we don't have to do any action learning ahead of time, and we have a set of high-level actions already, and we're just trying to sequence them together. And in fact, a lot of the other work that has been going on in the space, you can also think of as filling in various other pieces of this diagram that we've been looking at so far. And what's exciting about this is that most of what these other approaches that we're putting on the screen, SayCan and these other things are doing, is much more sophisticated than the corresponding pieces of this model that I've been showing you before. And so you can think of this SL-cubed approach as not just a sort of a particular way of doing instruction following, but like a general framework for using language to supervise these policy learning tasks, where there's lots of room to improve on any individual piece of this sort of overall architecture that I've been showing before. Okay, so to sort of summarize, this is not the right summary section, but to summarize this part of the talk, we looked at ways of using natural language to supervise policy learning tasks. And we looked at, saw a sort of specific hierarchical model architecture that could be trained just using like free-form natural language supervision, and that was able to go out and interact in the environment and generalize in all kinds of interesting ways and do quite well, in fact, sort of state-of-the-art on a bunch of household simulated robotics tasks. Cool. So, this is a sort of seminar about large language models and code. And so what I want to talk about for the rest of this session is how we might take this sort of basic machinery for learning from natural language supervision that we've just developed and apply it to other problems, and especially problems where what we're trying to do is generate not a sequence of low-level actions, but in fact, some sort of executable program.
And Jacob, a quick question. Jacob, a quick question about the first part. So one question is about how to deal with ambiguity. Let's say we saw an example, hit the apple in the microwave. So how do you know, let's say, how much to hit it or things like that, this ambiguity? And also if you can clarify about the loss function that we optimized.
Okay, great. So in terms of how to deal with these kinds of ambiguities, I think this is another nice thing about learning these action primitives from the data rather than having to specify them ahead of time, is that if there's some like conventional distribution over the amount of time that you would heat an apple in the microwave, and maybe that's different for an apple and some other thing, then you can just learn that from the data. I should say in this Alfred environment in particular, because it's simulated, there isn't actually, a sort of amount of time that you set the apple to be in the microwave. But in sort of the real world, or for even ambiguous things in this environment, just like where even you would find an object or which of two copies of an object you would prefer to pick up if it's ambiguous. The whole point is that just comes out of the data. And so if it's not the sort of thing that people think is salient to talk about when they're labeling these demonstrations, then sort of pragmatically, you can assume that it's just inferable from the high level goal and the model should do whatever the mode of that distribution is. In terms of the objective that we're optimizing, it's just the sort of complete likelihood of the data. And so in particular, this language model planner, like I said before, is just a fine-tuned language model. Each of these skills, the sort of model that maps from natural language sub-goal descriptions to low-level actions, turns out to also just be a fine-tuned language model, which was not something we were expecting would be helpful, but actually works quite well. And there's a little cleverness that you have to do to get the vision information into that model, but it's basically that. And so we have two neural networks that are just like neural seek-to-seek language models. One is trying to generate subtasks from goals. One of them is trying to generate low-level actions from subtask descriptions. And we're just finding parameters of those models jointly with all these other latent variables that maximize the complete likelihood.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, any questions before we go on? This is great.
Angad here. What's the observation where this model go into the failure situations or the wrong steps will be after prediction or so? And what is the observation where it is failed?
Okay, great question. So one thing that this model is still pretty bad at is exploration in general. And so on the tasks where we're the sort of high-level goals that we fail to complete, like in this Alfred test set now, I think almost all of them have to do with you've been directed to find some object and the model is just not learning from these demonstrations how to sort of explore in the environment to find an object that's not initially in its field of view. Another sort of high-level failure mode that this model exhibits that we're sort of have some thoughts on how to fix right now is that it's not great at replanning. And so, right, it could be that you generate a plan that says heat the apple in the microwave, and then it turns out there is no microwave in the environment at all, and you need to heat it on the stovetop instead. And right now, right, even as we've sort of drawn this, there isn't a feedback loop between the low-level vision and the high-level planning, except at the very beginning of this process. And so if you fail to find a microwave, there isn't an easy way for the model to sort of adjust to that on the fly. And so the way we deal with that right now is just if you run for some number of time steps and you don't succeed, then you just resample a new high-level goal that's different from the original one, and you hope that that's now compatible with your environment. But there are much more sophisticated things that one could do there. Sure. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm gonna move on to the actual program piece of this, but I'm gonna answer more at the end. Okay, right, so like we said, this sort of second half of the talk is gonna be about taking this machinery that we developed and applying it to programming problems. And so what we're gonna sort of think of as our canonical problem now is the problem of inductive program synthesis. And so rather than going from high-level goals to sequences of actions, we're going to start with some kind of specification, like an image that we want to figure out how to draw with some kind of graphics program, or a set of test cases that we want to pass, say with some sort of string processing routine, and to go from these low-level specifications to a piece of code that, when executed, satisfies the specification. And these kinds of program synthesis problems come up all the time. They come up in text editing. You'd like to be able to go into your text editor and make a couple edits and then just say, do that everywhere else. And like, especially in the sort of vision literature in the form of these inverse graphics problems. And just like in the first half of this talk, doing well at these inductive program synthesis tasks is all about abstraction and composition, right? In the same way that sort of plans are compositional from the first half, programs are also compositional. And if I have some family of related tasks that I'm trying to solve, like a bunch of these graphics drawing tasks, I expect pieces of the programs that solve those tasks to get used over and over again. And if I can identify and name those pieces, then the space of programs that I need to reason about or search over when trying to satisfy my specifications is going to become a lot smaller. And the state of the field in sort of inductive program synthesis is actually quite similar to policy learning, right? There are things that work well if you carefully design some kind of domain-specific language for the domain of interest, and things that work sort of okay in a fully unsupervised way, starting with extremely low-level programming languages like pure lambda calculus or whatever. But there aren't great procedures that automatically discover reusable functions that align with the kinds of abstractions that people tend to use. And as before, the sort of human-like abstractions for writing programs are precisely those things that tend to get names in natural language, right? There's a reason that most functions that we write are functions that we actually sort of know how to name with a relatively short string. And building on this intuition, the sort of idea in the second half of the talk is going to be that language can again provide for a very lightweight distant supervision to help us understand the compositional structure of program synthesis problems. And in fact, we can tackle this inductive program synthesis problem using a model that looks very similar to the one that we were looking at in the first half of our talk. And so what we're going to do is we're going to, as before, write down some kind of generative model whereby natural language descriptions of programs give rise to programs themselves via sort of reusable program fragments that get composed together, just like our skills before. These composed program fragments, when executed, are going to produce the low-level outputs that we observe. Now, one very important difference between this and the policy learning problems that we were looking at before is that we're going to assume that we only ever have access to our test cases. These programs are the things that we're trying to infer, and we're going to assume that even at training time, we don't have access to any ground truth program annotations. This is sort of the defining feature of program synthesis problems. And it means that when we think about our model as a latent variable problem, or as a latent variable model, that we have one more quantity that we need to think about, namely the programs themselves as another latent variable. And so what we're going to do is we're going to write down a model that looks structurally similar to the model that we had before, right? We are going to sort of generate programs conditioned on natural language and then generate outputs conditioned on these programs. But the structure of each of these models is actually going to be pretty different from what we looked at before. In particular, the execution model, we're going to assume that we don't have to learn at all, right? I'm writing programs. I already have some executor for those programs. And so I'm just going to be able to hand those off. And the program generation model also is going to be a little bit more interesting. Rather than just being a big neural seek-to-seek model like we had in the first half of the talk, the specific form of this program generation model is going to matter. It's going to be backed it's going to be backed by like a discrete library of functions tagged with natural language strings that are going to get composed together. And so this generative process is going to build programs from strings by composing these functions that it's learned together. This is very abstract. We'll see an example of sort of what this process looks like in a minute. In particular, when we do our sort of learning loop, like the learning loop that we did before, the parameter update step is now going to be the interesting part of this procedure. Training this model, updating this program generator that we saw before is going to look not like updating the weights of a neural network, but like adding extra functions to this library that it's using to generate programs from strings. And so in particular, we're going to optimize a sort of description length objective that's going to try to find new library fragments that minimize the description length of all of the programs that we've solved and the library itself in terms of chunks of that library. And again, I think the easiest way to look at this is through an example rather than a formal specification. So let's dive into that right now. Suppose that in the course of sort of solving this learning problem, I have the following 3 programs. And don't worry yet about where they came from. And each of these programs is labeled with natural language descriptions. So one that says 7 gone, one that says 5 gone, one that says acute angle. When we do this parameter update step, our library learning step, what we're going to do is notice that there's a repeated fragment in all of these programs. And this fragment shows up only in programs annotated with the word gone. Now, notice looking at these programs that there are some other repeated fragments as well, right? This like rotate 72 line shows up in the second program and the third program, but it doesn't align consistently to any particular natural language string, whereas this gone function does. And noticing that, what we're going to do is we're going to extract out a new function for our program library that contains this fragment, right? That has a sort of it's a 2-argument function. It's going to drop those functions in place, but is going to pull out the reusable piece that occurred in each of these programs that was tagged with the word gone. We're now going to rewrite both of these programs that we had before and the annotations that we had before in terms of this new function that we just pulled out. And we've now compressed our data set. I only have to keep around 1 copy of this gone function. And now, my sort of programs themselves are much shorter. And so what I've done here is effectively used language to help me discover some reusable program fragment for doing polygon generation. And so what this looks like when we actually sort of run this whole training loop analogous to the training loop that we had in the first half of the talk is as follows. We're going to start with a bunch of specifications and natural language annotations for these specifications. We're going to search for programs in some base program language, just like a brute force search, or maybe with some little heuristics that can look at the image, but nothing very sophisticated. And we'll probably fail to find programs that satisfy most of these specifications, but maybe we'll find one like this one that draws a tiny triangle. And once we found a few programs, we'll compress these programs using this procedure that we saw before, and add these functions that we compressed out back to the library that we use for doing search. And now once we've done that, we've made our search problem easier. And when we go back to the search step, we can find more program fragments, abstract more reusable pieces, and so on and so forth. Some other things to call out here, the sort of basic like compression loop here is not new. We're inheriting an algorithm from Kevin Ellis, who's a professor at Cornell now, the Dreamcoder work, which is super, super cool, and I encourage you to look at that. And what we're doing here that's sort of different from what's gone on in the program synthesis literature before is that we're using these natural language annotations to drive this compression process. And we're selectively trying to find annotations or try to find reusable program fragments that not only show up a lot in the set of solved programs, but that have consistent natural language descriptions. And the idea there is that, in a small set of programs, there's a bunch of reusable pieces. Only some of them are actually meaningful to people, and language is going to reveal to us which those reusable, meaningful pieces are. There's a bunch of other cool stuff that goes on here that I'm not going to be able to talk about today. The program or this procedure can actually refactor these programs to make them more compressible before it pulls out the pieces. So we're not just matching on strings. And there's a bunch of sort of linguistically interesting stuff that goes on in this generative process that makes it more likely that we're actually going to find sort of reusable human meaningful pieces. But at the end of the day, this is sort of the basic skeleton of the procedure, and it works quite well. And so here are some examples of programs expressed in terms of these reusable pieces that we found for some of these inverse graphics tasks that we were looking at before. And you can see that we can do some quite complicated ones that bottom out in terms of, clean functional abstractions that, as you can see from these examples on the slide, like really do correspond to names like snowflake or semicircle or polygon. And when you run this on sort of standard program synthesis benchmarks, just by getting these natural language annotations and using this sort of modified compression procedure that I talked about, you can do way better than sort of state-of-the-art approaches that try to do inductive program synthesis without this kind of natural language guidance. And here's a sort of closer look at the kinds of libraries that we can learn using this approach. And you can see that we get all kinds of interesting functions that call each other, and we're able to tag each of these functions with a sensible natural language description. And so these words that are in italics here are the words that we align to each of these program fragments. Think of them sort of as corresponding to the names of each of these functions. And you see we get our gone function, we get our circle function, we get a zigzag function, we get a snowflake function. So even sort of very complicated program primitives we're able to pull out in this way. Good. So what we did in this section is extend this approach that we looked at for policy learning to do program learning instead. And we showed that you could sort of hook this policy learning approach that we had before up to Dreamcoder, up to a state-of-the-art program synthesis engine, and use that to do language-guided learning of reusable program libraries and program induction itself. And on even sort of very tiny data sets of programs, we can use language to help us solve very hard program induction problems. Now, what's been missing from this section is the sort of actual title of this seminar, which is the use of large language models for programming. So, this is all sort of old school AI. Even the piece of this model that aligns program fragments to chunks of language is a statistical machine translation model from 1991. So a naturalness question is, how does a really good model of code change the story in the same way that a really good model of language was able to change our story for these planning problems?
Two quick questions about this part.
Yeah.
So one question is about how do you compute the connection, this measure of connection between the natural language and the code. And the second question is about if you can elaborate about the step where you take an action and you split it.
In terms of how you find the correspondence between pieces of language and pieces of programs, or words in language and these program fragments, this actually looks very similar to the first half of the talk. So inside this program generation model, there are latent alignments that look like the alignments that we had before. And so you have this generative process by which I have a string, the string gets segmented into pieces. Each of those pieces independently generates a program fragment, and then those program fragments get composed together. And so in the course of doing inference in this model, when you generate, what the correspondence is between a chunk of language and a chunk of a program. And when you're training the model, when you're doing inference in a model, you're actually inferring which chunk of a program corresponded to which word. So basically, you get those correspondences for free just from the way that we've written down this generative model. And the generative model looks probably easier to do it. My navigator here looks a lot like this, where sort of hidden inside that diagram that I showed before, there are actually alignments between pieces of programs or pieces of language and pieces of programs. And sorry, the other question was how do you do the splitting? I guess I'm not quite sure what that means. I mean, I guess one interpretation is like, when you're here, how do you know that this is the program fragment to pull out, and how do you know what to leave behind?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So again, you could do this very simply, and there's actually like more recent work from the PL folks at MIT showing that you can do quite well just doing string match, right? Saying sort of in my set of solved programs, what are just like the program substrings that co-occur most frequently, and there are data structures that you can build that let you compute the like most frequently occurring program template relatively efficiently. There's actually some magic that goes on in Dreamcoder under the hood that does some refactoring to try to get things into a normal form before it does that. But you can think of it basically as like, I have a bunch of programs. I'm just going to find the most efficient, the sort of template that occurs most frequently and co-occurs also with a natural language string most frequently.
So just to clarify, over the course of training, the pieces of code that you, let's say, split or choose as a low primitive actions, let's say, or so do they get splitted again?
No, so once I've added a function to the library, it just sits in the library. And I can use it, when I go back and search, I can now express my other, the new programs that I search for in terms of things that I've added to the library. But once something goes into the library, I don't touch it anymore. And so, what's nice about this is that if I screw up and I add something to the library that's not reusable, it increases the branching factor of my search space, but it's not going to prevent me from finding other programs because I can always search for things in terms of the base programming language. Okay, and I do want to sort of at least try to briefly get through this last piece, since I think this is the most on topic and also the future direction that I'm most excited about here. So right, here's a sort of picture of the procedure that we drew before. We're alternating between this library learning step, this segmentation step, and this program search step. And right here, for none of these steps, did we actually use any sort of background knowledge about what code in general looks like. And there's obviously now a lot of interest in using language models to support these kinds of inductive program synthesis problems, and they're mostly focused on this program search step. So rather than sort of doing a brute force search, brute force enumeration of all of the programs until we try to find one that solves a given specification, we can take a pre-trained language model or a prompted language model or a fine-tuned language model and try to use that as a search heuristic to help me do better at solving these kinds of problems. But this doesn't actually work all that well, right? Compared to just like brute force search, querying a big neural network and especially querying a huge transformer model is quite slow. And so you can consider and reject a number of simple programs in the time that it takes you to query your big language model once. And maybe more fundamentally, right, we sometimes care about doing this for synthesis problems where specifications don't take the form of text, where they're images or demonstrations on continuous space or whatever. And in these cases, it's not even clear how to sort of pipe the specification in to the language model in a way that would turn it into a useful search heuristic. To say this again, right, our sort of synthesis engines, things that work like the model that I was talking in the previous section, know a lot about how to execute programs. They're really able to reason in a fine-grained way about program semantics. They don't know anything about the real-world distribution of programs. Big LMs like Codex know a lot about what real-world programs look like, but there's been a lot of work showing that they're very bad as models of execution if you don't give them extra scaffolding, and so they're not necessarily all that helpful for synthesis. And so the question is, how do we put these two things together? And what I want to suggest is that the right way to do this, or the most effective way to do this, is actually not to use them as heuristics at the search stage, but to help us with the problem of writing these libraries themselves. And so what can we do with big language models to help us with this library learning step in a way that will then allow us to do like classical search more efficiently or more effectively than we were doing it before? And to sort of understand how we're going about this, or one way of going about this, let's think about what we get as a result of this program search step that we were looking at before, right? And what we get is a bunch of programs. Here's a program that draws a triangle. And if you look at this program, even if you don't necessarily know the programming language in which this is expressed, you can probably guess that this is a program that's drawing a triangle. It refers to a pen. There's a loop over three things. There's a 60-degree angle. And this is the sort of thing that big language models know about as well. And so if you just go to a big code language model and you say, hey, here's a program I found. Give me some more programs that look like it, but are a little bit different. You get programs that look like this. You get programs that match the same template, but that draw squares rather than triangles. You get programs that go off in different directions and things like that. And notice that some of these parameters are always getting changed together. Some of them are getting sort of left totally alone and not being touched at all. And what this means is that these big language models, even if they don't know how to execute this program, understand enough about the semantics to know what the sort of plausible sources of variation are, and in particular, what pieces of this program are likely to get reused and what pieces of this program are likely to change when we apply it to new problems. And so we can use this by just adding an extra step into this sort of like library learning segmentation search loop that we looked at before, that we call an example extrapolation step, where once we found a bunch of programs, before we go about trying to compress them and add new functions to our library, we go off to a big language model and say, hey, here's some programs I found, give me some more. And notice, right, that if we just have this single example of a solved program on the bottom left, and we tried to compress it, it's not clear, what we should be trying to compress at all, because no piece of this program looks naively any more compressible or any more reusable than anything else, right? We have one program, we don't know which pieces of that program are going to be reused or not. We go to a big language model and we say, give us more programs that look like this. And now we know which pieces are going to change, which pieces are going to stay the same, which pieces maybe need to get modified together and which need to get left alone. And so we can start with this one example of a program, which previously we wouldn't have been able to compress before, and now pull out our ngon function immediately, just from this single example of a program with help from a big language model. And so very concretely, right, what kinds of functions is this example extrapolation step going to let us learn? Well, one, it can sort of identify what the parameters of our functions are and what the constants of our functions are, and identify the sort of sources of parametric variation that are going to live inside the templates that we eventually want to extract. It can identify dependencies between particular variables of these programs, right? That it can say, okay, the 3 and the 60 here, they can change, but they have to change together because we're drawing a polygon and there's a relationship between the number of sides of a polygon and its interior angle. And maybe most importantly and most excitingly, if we have access to our natural language annotations like we were looking at before, we can do this in a targeted way. So if I know eventually I'm going to be asked to draw now a sort of double struck pentagon with thick lines, maybe I don't know how to solve that problem quite yet. Maybe even this sort of natural language hint is not detailed enough to fully specify the pentagon function that I'm trying to draw. But if I ask it to generate programs that look like a pentagon with double lines, I can start to give myself this double lines function and extract it out into my library, even if I'm not quite getting these programs right, or I don't quite know where to use this double lines function. And to sort of think about formally what a language model might do in the generative model that we were looking at before, we can think of it as sort of giving us a posterior constraint on the programs or on the full set of programs that we're finding here, where we're saying keep the generative model from before, but make it so that the set of programs that you sample from this generative model looks marginally like the kinds of programs that your language model would write. And the cool thing is that adding this example extrapolation step actually helps quite a lot with a bunch of these program synthesis problems. So the blue lines here are a program synthesis engine. This is newer than Dreamcoder. It's called Stitch. It's really good. It's really fast. It's quite hard to beat. But if you give it access to a language model and do this example extrapolation step that we talked about before, you can actually solve a bunch of these inductive synthesis tasks a lot faster. And what's cool is that, it's especially helpful to have these natural language annotations, and you can do, you can get some very surprising forms of generalization with these natural language annotations. And so, here in this regex domain, there's like a big jump at some point when some new function gets added to the library. And we can actually look in and see what function the language model caused us to add to the library here. And it was produced by examples that look like this. So we said, hey, extrapolate, and extrapolate conditioned on the instruction is if there's a vowel, replace that with VP. We're doing now these sort of text editing tasks rather than the image tasks we looked at before. So you say, if there's a vowel, replace that with VP, and Codex gives you the following conditioned on a set of solved problems. Now, some important things to notice about this. The first thing to notice about this program is that it is wrong. If executed, it will not actually take a string and replace all the vowels in the string with VP. But the other thing to notice about it is that it contains a reusable chunk of a function that recognizes the class of vowels. And this is an abstraction that, in fact, you never get with any of these inductive program synthesis models on sort of real problems. It's really hard to get these disjunctive abstractions, both because they're big and complicated and because it's never clear from any individual example that you need them. But Codex just nails this. And so by synthesizing this wrong example and then trying to compress it, we add to our library a vowel function that we can then use when we do our search procedure on the real specifications, and that allows us to solve a bunch of problems where otherwise we would have had no idea what a vowel is and where we would not have been able to solve them. Good. So, this is all super preliminary, nothing published, but seems quite promising. And I think is the right way to think about how we should be using these big language models to support, especially these inductive synthesis tasks, that really what they're good models of is models of libraries and models of reuse rather than execution. But when you combine those with a really fast executor, the combination is quite powerful. Good. So to sort of wrap up this last section of the talk, right, we looked at how to solve these same inductive program synthesis problems, and even synthesis problems that sort of don't involve strings as inputs or outputs, using a large language model as guidance. And specifically what these language models did was sort of hallucinate code that seems like it's related to a set of solved problems. And using this hallucinated code, we were able to identify the reusable abstractions in a given domain of interest, pull them out, add them to our library, and make our search problem easier. And we saw that by doing this, we can, again, sort of do well on standard program synthesis benchmarks, especially when the kinds of things that our synthesizer needs are sort of common sense abstractions like vowel that you would learn about from looking at a bunch of real code, but that you would never learn about or never invent on your own. And with that, I will wrap up there. As always, the sort of credit all goes to the students who did this work, and I can stick around for a few minutes for questions if people have time.
Okay, so I don't see we have more questions.
Oh,
so,
I have a question. I have a question actually. Jacob, you said that LLMs are bad at providing search heuristics. For example, programs. What are your examples where you're like, that convinces me that they're bad?
Well, so I think they're bad, not in the sense that they're actually wrong, but that they're very slow. So, like the piece of this that I find most convincing is like the AlphaCode work from DeepMind. They had better models that they didn't use for the final competition because they would rather be able to draw, they're doing like massive scale rejection sampling. They're sampling 1 million programs or something and then filtering down to the ones that actually work. And they would much rather be able to have 1 million mediocre programs than like 100,000 good programs, just because even the good programs are not sort of close enough to the targets to actually hit things directly. And, I think this is sort of generally true that at any scale, until these models get much, much, much better than they are today and basically can solve these problems in a zero-shot way, you would rather be able to do really fast search in the language of your choice rather than have a really, a sort of better heuristic model that you had before, but that you can only query 10 times less frequently or 100 times less frequently. And, this is something like, we were very excited about the heuristics angle when we started this project. And it's just like really hard to beat dumb and iterative search for speed.
So Jacob, I have a question. So how do you tag a program with natural language string? Do you extract from the comments of the program, or is it manually tagged?
I didn't get any of that. If somebody else heard and can interpret, otherwise maybe you can type it in the chat. Sorry, I don't know why my slides keep disappearing here. Meanwhile, Miguel Acevedo said in the chat, is there a way to replicate library learning through in-context learning, few shot rather than fine tuning? Yeah, so this is a great question. I mean, so we are actually doing in the second part of the process in-context learning. We're using Codex. You can't get your hands on Codex. You can't fine tune it. And so the way, when we say over here, synthesize for me more programs that look like this, we're doing this by just prompting the language model with the programs that we've already solved and saying, give me more. So yeah, I think, the sort of fine tuning versus prompting distinction is sort of independent of everything that we're doing here. As long as you have some way of specializing a language model to deal with your domain of interest, then you can do this. Okay, next question. For training, are the programs manually tagged with natural language strings, or are they extracted from the comments in the program? Sorry. So for all the experiments that we've just been looking at, these are manually annotated. So these are sort of existing synthesis benchmarks, and basically we just took them, we put them up on Mechanical Turk, and we said, sort of describe what this picture is, and not describe the program that implements it, because we don't have the programs. Okay, another question. As you mentioned, generated programs could be wrong, even though parts could be extrapolated to be useful. Is the verification of these programs also something that can be improved on? Yeah, absolutely. And, I think, right, another way forward here is to take these hallucinated programs and repair them. And, again, especially once you get to sort of specifications that are provided in a language that the language model itself doesn't know about, right? Once you're trying to deal with images or whatever, I think there's a lot of really interesting room to use like classical verification, classical repair techniques in combination with this top-down information from language models. Question, what if we use Codex LMs to reverse generate natural language descriptions? Will these augmented descriptions help with library learning? That is a great question. So, one sort of important thing that happens when you use Codex to try to do this, right? This sort of, the search procedure that we were using in the first PL section of this talk doesn't care what any of the functions are named, right? You have a library of functions. If you call them F32 or F24 or whatever, that's not going to affect the search procedure at all. Codex cares a lot about what functions are called because it's, because it was trained on human generated code, and humans use the fact that function names are meaningful to figure out what they do. Codex also really relies very heavily on names of functions. And if you have something that's totally obfuscated, it's much worse at generating related programs or preserving the semantics or whatever than if the function names are meaningful. So the particular way in which it's really, I think, really important to reverse generate descriptions is so that you can assign to these functions that you're abstracting like real meaningful names that Codex can then reason about when it's extrapolating new examples of uses of those functions. Can program synthesis be combined with modular networks? Ooh, yeah. So, I mean, for context here, this is, there was a bunch of work that people did, sort of me and others, before the whole transformer thing happened, on building neural networks with sort of out of little reusable pieces that you can think of as looking like program fragments, but where every program fragment is a neural net that you can backprop through. And so the question is, what's the role of those kinds of models in PLE kinds of tasks? And the version of this that we've been thinking about most, and like Max and I, who was a grad student at MIT, had this very cool iClear paper a couple years back on using those kinds of like specialized neural architectures to guide search procedures, specifically by using them to sort of learn an abstract semantics that looks like abstract interpretation, again, from the sort of classical PL literature, but where the model figures out what the tightest abstraction possible is, and does all that reasoning in representation space. I'm actually not so sure that we really need those kinds of architectures anymore, in the sense that, the kinds of modular networks that we were building before, you can basically embed inside a sufficiently deep transformer now that, if you use the attention heads in the transformer to do the routing, they start to look a lot like modular networks. And there's a bunch of cool stuff. Like there were some folks actually at Tel Aviv University who had a bunch of papers on, sort of modular networks where you could learn the structure end to end, and they really just look like transformers with restricted attention masks. And so I suspect that the kinds of things that we would do with those model architectures now, transformers are already doing. And then there's a really interesting interpretability question to figure out what that looks like. But yeah. Okay, when using LMs to extrapolate, how do we decide which program fragments are correct, and how do we know if a program is decomposed enough to say that it's a fragment? Yeah, so we don't. And I think the whole sort of point of this procedure is that, like at the end of the day, our criterion for extracting a program fragment is that it shows up in multiple places. It reduces the description length of our data set. And the idea is that what you want to do what makes a fragment like really correct or reusable is that it reduces the description length of the entire distribution over programs that you will ever need to solve, and not just the set of programs that you've solved so far. And so what language models are doing in this context is, making a better guess at what the entire distribution over programs looks like beyond just the particular set of examples that we have in front of us. And what's cool is that even when they don't sort of exactly get that distribution right, they're close enough to it that the extraction works better. Okay, I should probably pop off, but I'll go back to the beginning of the talk. Here's my email, and happy to answer other questions that people have for anything else.
Okay, so I would like to personally thank Jacob for delivering such an engaging and informative presentation. Your insights are invaluable, and I learned so much from your talk. Thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge with us. Your contribution to the seminar is generally appreciated. Our next seminar session will feature Uri Alon from Carnegie Mellon University, and will take place in the last week of January. To stay updated, sign up for our mailing list or subscribe to our calendar. A link to our website is in the chat now. I'm sending it now. So please note that we have speakers and participants from around the world. So our seminars may be scheduled on different days of the week and at different hours to accommodate different time zones. I hope you all enjoyed the meeting, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any feedback or suggestions for improvement. Thank you so much for joining us today.